By the 22nd of August 1944, the strength report that reached Army Group B headquarters was almost too short to believe. 10 tanks, 300 men, no artillery at all. That was everything left of a division that had rolled into the fighting in Normandy just 11 weeks earlier with more than 20,000 soldiers and roughly 150 tanks on the road. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the formation built from teenage volunteers. The unit Germany had sold to itself as the hardest and most fanatical armoured division in the entire army, had been reduced to the fighting power of a single company. 11 weeks. That is all it took for the Western Allies to take one of the most feared divisions in the German order of battle and grind it down to almost nothing. This is the story of exactly how they did it, step by step, and why the whole idea behind this division failed the moment it met the full weight of Allied firepower. To understand how far it fell, you have to understand how high it started and why it existed at all. The 12th SS Panzer Division carried the name Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, and the name was not decoration, it was literal. By 1943, the German regime had a problem. It did not like to say out loud. Its supply of grown men was running dry. Years of fighting on the Eastern Front had drained the pool of experienced soldiers, and the leadership went looking for a new source of manpower. They found it in the youth movement, in the ranks of boys who had been raised inside the regime from childhood. The plan was to build a full armoured division around volunteers drawn from that pool, most of them born in 1926. When the invasion of France came, the bulk of the riflemen in this division were 17 years old. Think about what that actually means. These were young men who had been small children when the war began. They had never known an adult life outside the regime. They had been taught, drilled, and shaped by the movement since they could barely read, and now that entire upbringing was being cashed in for one purpose, to produce soldiers who would not break. The theory was blunt and cold. Take boys with no memory of peacetime, train them relentlessly, and you would get men who did not understand the concept of retreat. But you cannot run a division on teenagers alone, and the German command knew it. So the young volunteers were stiffened with a core of veterans. The officers and many of the senior sergeants were pulled from the Leibstandarte, the premier SS division, men who had years of hard combat behind them on the Eastern Front. That cadre was the spine of the unit. The idea was that experienced hands would supply the tactical judgment, while the young soldiers supplied the aggression and the willingness to keep going when a normal unit would have pulled back. The equipment matched the ambition. On paper, the establishment for the division called for 229 tanks and assault guns, a genuinely powerful armoured force by 1944 standards. In practice, when the invasion actually came, mechanical wear and supply shortages meant the division could put roughly 150 tanks on the road at any one time. Behind those tanks stood 658 armoured vehicles of every type, and a total strength of 20,540 men. It was young, it was well armed, and it was confident. And it had one glaring weakness that no amount of training could fix. It had never seen combat. That inexperience is the hinge of the whole story. The men who built this division believed a hard enough unit could absorb anything the enemy threw at it. Normandy was about to put that belief up against the entire machine of the British, Canadian, and American armies. And a machine is exactly the right word for what was waiting. The test began on the 7th of June, one single day after the landings. The division was rushed toward the area around the city of Cam, which the Allies needed, and the Germans were determined to hold. The first Allied force the young division ran into was the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, fresh off the beaches and pushing inland toward the villages of Buron and Authie, just northwest of Cam. That is where the two sides collided for the first time. For the 17-year-old rifleman of the 12th SS, this was the first shot fired in anger, and at first the training seemed to pay off. They attacked with the aggression they had been drilled to show, and they pushed the leading Canadian units back, retaking villages and driving toward the coast. To a young soldier in that first flush of combat, it must have looked like the theory was right. Aggression worked. Then the Canadians steadied. They dug in, brought up their supporting tanks and their artillery, and made the young Germans pay for every field and every hedgerow. Over the next day, the fighting spread to the villages of Puteaux and Norry. where Canadian infantry and armour held their line against repeated assaults by the SS. The attacks that had looked unstoppable on the first morning started to stall against a defence that would not crack. The young division was learning, at close range and at heavy cost, that the enemy in front of it did not scare. It is worth being clear about the character of this unit from the very start, because it shaped everything that came after. The division's reputation was built partly on its conduct toward Canadian prisoners near Ardennes Abbey in those first days, an early war crime that would eventually put its commander on trial. That is a matter of record, and it belongs in the story. But the military reality of that first week is what concerns us here, and the military reality was stark. The 12th SS had marched confidently into a battle it did not yet understand, and the enemy it could see, the Canadian infantry and their tanks, was only a fraction of the force actually arrayed against it. The larger part of that force was an enemy the young soldiers could barely touch. Picture the situation around Caen from the German side. Off the coast of Normandy sat the Allied fleet, and the heavy guns of those warships could reach many miles inland. There was no cover from them, no counter to them, and no way for a tank division to fight back against a battleship sitting over the horizon. On the 14th of June, that naval firepower found the divisional command post at a place called wwii. A Royal Navy bombardment came down directly on the headquarters and ended the life of the division's first commander, SS Brigadefuhrer Fritz Witt. Witt was the man who had shaped and trained the division, its founding commander, and a single naval barrage removed him in an afternoon. No enemy soldier ever got near him. The guns did it from the sea. Command passed to a 33-year-old officer named Kurt Meyer, already a well-known figure inside the SS, under the nickname Panzermeyer. Meyer was aggressive, experienced, and precisely the kind of leader the division had been designed around. He would hold command for the rest of the Normandy campaign, and this is a detail worth keeping in mind, because his fate and the division's fate would split apart. The division around him was about to be destroyed. Meyer himself would be wounded in the fighting, but he would survive, and he would keep leading the shrinking unit right to the very end. Now we come to the part of the Normandy story that most people get wrong when they imagine it. They picture tank against tank, young SS crews duelling British and Canadian armour across the fields. That happened, but it was not the decisive factor. The weapon that truly took this division apart was not the tank at all. It was the gun and the bomber. The Allies fought the battle for Caen as, above everything else, an artillery war. British and Canadian field batteries fired enormous, carefully planned programs, walking curtains of shell fire across the German positions before their own infantry even began to move. For soldiers on the receiving end, there was no aggression that answered it. You could be the bravest young rifleman in the division, and it made no difference to a shell fired from 3 miles away by a gunner who never saw your face. Add to the artillery the weight of the heavy bombers. To break open the defences around Caen, the Allies launched massive air raids, dropping thousands of tons of bombs onto the northern approaches to the city, churning the ground into a landscape the defenders could barely cross in daylight. For a division whose entire doctrine was built on aggressive movement and concentrated armoured counterattacks, this was the worst possible environment. The German way of war depended on gathering your tanks, striking hard at a chosen point, and breaking the enemy with speed. But every time the 12th SS tried to concentrate its armour for a proper counterattack, Allied artillery observers and fighter bombers spotted the movement from the air and brought fire down on the assembly areas before the attack could even launch. The young division that had been trained to charge found itself pinned in place instead, losing a few men and a few vehicles at a time, hour after hour, day after day, to an enemy it often could not even shoot at. This is where the story turns in a direction no one in the German command wanted to face. You cannot out-fanatic a naval gun. You cannot out-train a 1,000-plane bomber raid. All the willpower that had been bred into these young soldiers was worth very little against firepower that arrived from beyond their reach. Their greatest supposed strength, their refusal to give ground, simply meant they stood in the beaten zone longer and absorbed more of it. By early July, the Allies were ready to take the city of Caen itself, and the operation they launched to do it was named Charnwood. It opened, predictably, with one of those heavy bomber raids on the northern part of the city, followed by a broad assault from British and Canadian infantry with armoured support. The 12th SS was dug in directly across the path of that attack, holding the ground the Allies had decided to take. The young soldiers fought hard. That has never been in dispute, not even among the Allied units facing them. They held strong points in the rubble. They launched local counterattacks, and they forced the attacking troops to grind through them position by position on the edge of the city. But holding hard against that kind of firepower carries a price, and the price shows up in the division's own strength returns. By the time the fighting around Caen had run its course in early to mid-July, the arithmetic had become brutal. The division that had entered Normandy able to field around 150 tanks was now down to roughly 65 runners, and its casualties had climbed to somewhere around 60% of the men it had started with. Stop and sit with that figure for a moment, because it is the heart of the whole story. 60%. In roughly 1 month of combat, the 12th SS had lost well over half of the soldiers it began with. The teenage riflemen who had pushed the Canadians back at Authie in the first week of June were, in large numbers, already out of the fight by the middle of July, 1 month later. The reinforcements trickling in could not come close to matching the losses. The division was being consumed faster than Germany could feed it. If Meyer had been able to pull the division out of the line at that point, rest it, and rebuild it around its survivors, this might have become a different story. He could not. The German front in Normandy was too thin and under too much pressure to spare the unit, and the Allies were not slowing down. They were about to speed up dramatically. If you are getting something out of this breakdown, this look at how a supposedly elite division actually came apart under the numbers, take a second to subscribe. This channel goes deep on the weapons and the units of the Second World War, the real figures behind the famous reputations, and there is a great deal more on the way. By August, the entire shape of the battle in Normandy had changed. Far to the west, the American armies had broken out of the beachhead and were swinging around behind the German forces in a huge arc. To the east, the British and Canadians kept pressing south toward the town of Falaise. Between those two Allied movements, the whole German army in the region was suddenly in danger of being surrounded, squeezed into a shrinking pocket, with only one narrow gap left as an escape route. And the 12th SS, or what remained of it, was handed one of the worst jobs in the entire campaign. Hold the shoulder of that gap open long enough for tens of thousands of other German troops to get out through it. By this stage, the division was no longer a fresh formation of 20,000. It was a worn-down remnant, a scattering of surviving tanks and exhausted infantry held together mostly by Meyer's will and by the veteran officers who were somehow still standing. And that remnant was told to plant itself directly in the path of the advancing Canadian army. The critical piece of ground was a stretch of high terrain northeast of Falaise, marked on the maps as Hill 159. From the 14th to the 16th of August, the remains of the 12th SS held that hill. By now, the division could field only a handful of tanks, something on the order of 15 runners at the very most. They sat on that high ground under almost continuous artillery fire and air attack, the exact same combination that had been taking them apart since the beginning of June, except that now there was far less of the division left to soak it up. And still they held, for a time. This is a part of the story most people never hear, and it deserves to be said plainly. The rearguard action the 12th SS fought around Falaise was, in cold military terms, effective far out of proportion to its tiny size. When the 2nd Canadian Division finally broke through on the western flank, the SS troops were forced off Hill 159, but they did not simply collapse and scatter. They fell back in order and kept fighting for the one thing that still mattered, the corridor. Because the corridor was everything now. With only a single avenue of escape still open, the remnants of the division were ordered to help hold the northern shoulder of the Falaise Gap, so that the trapped German 7th Army could pour out through it to safety. Around the 20th of August, fighting alongside other broken German units, they helped force that corridor back open when it was on the verge of closing for good. An estimated 10,000 German soldiers escaped the encirclement through the gap that these remnants helped to keep from sealing shut. Understand the exchange that was taking place on that ground. To buy that escape route for others, the 12th SS spent the last of itself. Every hour it held the shoulder open, it lost more of the men and machines it had no way of ever replacing. It was no longer fighting to win a battle or take an objective. It was fighting to hold on long enough for other men to get away, and paying for every one of those hours with its own remaining substance. By the 22nd of August, that job was essentially finished, for the simple reason that there was almost nothing left to do it with. And this brings us all the way back around to that short, stunning report at Army Group B. 10 tanks, 300 men, no artillery,